Dar, who's with us today to talk about his journey. I'm Katie Miller. I'm part of the iCore team here at MIT. I'm joined by my colleagues, Lisa Naquin and our executive director, Roman Lubinsky. So Roman, would you like to say a few words?
Sure. So thanks, Katie. Good afternoon to everybody. Great to see you all here. So this is part of a speaker series that we host here as the New England NSF iCore node. And we'll have additional Founders Journey and other speakers regularly. So keep a watch in your email box for announcements. So I would like to note that if you are a researcher considering a deep tech startup, the NSF iCore program may be able to be of help to you. There are iCore sites at other schools in New England. You can see the schools listed here on the page. All of them offer iCore customer discovery training. We also offer this customer discovery training at MIT, and we make our program available to anyone from any school that wishes to join. They're all virtual now, and we'll be running our 3-week-long iCore Spark program twice a month, pretty much, for the rest of the year. The next open courses begin on next week, April 28th, and then the next one after that is mid-May and then early June. For more info or to apply, you can just go to our website or email us. The links are on the screen, and just let us know that you're interested. So Waseem and his co-founders were working on a project called Caseflight back as graduate students, I think back in 2007 is, I think, when it started. And I was part of their VMS mentor team. Recall that they were getting ready to graduate and they'd submitted an SBIR proposal to the National Science Foundation. And the NSF program director sent them a note and said he wanted to do some follow-up on that proposal, and he wanted to have a call with all the team members in the room, and he asked them to bring one of their mentors with them. And I was I guess the designated mentor for that meeting. And I remember the call started out with loads of questions. Arrow was just peppering you guys with all kinds of questions about stuff. And none of the questions were about the technology. It was all about business questions, like who their customers were going to be. Now, I thought the team was doing a great job responding, but then Errol, the program director, just cut him off and kind of said, look, there's this book that was written by this guy named Steve Blank, 4 Steps to the Epiphany. And he uses it to teach a class out in Stanford on customer discovery. If you promise to read the first 4 chapters and follow what it says to do, I'll give you the award. Now, these are pretty bright MIT people, so they agreed to that. And they did get that award, and I think they kind of did follow that. And oh, is that the book? There's the startup manual. Yeah, so the predecessor to the startup manual. So now all this happened 3 or 4 years before iCore actually even got started. And of course, iCore is based on that same methodology that Steve Blank wrote about in the book. So they were iCore before there was iCore. I'll turn the mic back over to Katie now. Thanks.
Thanks, Roman. I'm just going to share my screen again. Yeah, so I just wanted to formally introduce Waseem. So as you just heard from Roman, he and his friends started Caseflight back in 2007 as they were graduating from MIT. They won the MIT 100K competition in 2009 and also received their SBIR award. And 2 years later, Ksplice was acquired by Oracle. They then went on to found another company called Zoule, which was also acquired. And now they're on your third company called Pilot, which focuses on financial software and services for startups and growing companies. They've over time raised $150 million. So while you've been really busy over the past decade plus, it seems like you had time to have some fun because just over a year ago, Waseem was also on Jeopardy. So who gets to say that they did that? Lots of people start companies, not everybody's on Jeopardy. So it just goes to show that you can always make time to have a little bit of fun. So while Waseem is talking and going through his journey, there's a Q&A box. So please feel free to put in questions as Waseem is talking, because I'm going to be moderating the Q&A at the end. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Waseem.
Great. Thank you all for joining. And Katie, Roman, Lisa, thank you all for having me. I find that this stuff is most interesting when we keep it very interactive, but what I was planning on doing is stepping through just a couple slides, actually mostly photos, to tell you a little bit about my own story and kind of how we got where we got, and then at the end, just kind of summarizing what some key lessons learned along the way. But in general, I think, you know, this is a great size audience in the sense that to the extent that there are things we'd like to double click on, let's do so. And if there are things that we kind of like to go with the flow, we can do that as well. So I want to start a little bit about talking about the journey of my co-founders and I in the various companies we've done. And what's interesting is that Jeff, Jessica, and I, my co-founders, met, I think like in 2005 at MIT undergrad, where we'd all say computer science. This is actually, Pilot is the third company we've done together. As kind of Katie mentioned, it's been a little bit of a story of getting the band back together. So I wanted to kind of go back to the very beginning. We had a company called Ksplice, and can folks see the slides okay? Is this working? Yes, Roman is nodding yes. Great. Okay, so what was Casebase? Casebase, we had technology. I'm sure you've seen this pop up. We had technology that could take software updates and apply them on a system while it was running without requiring the reboot. And the idea was, well, look, these software updates generally contain important security fixes, so you'd like to apply them as soon as possible, but you don't want to incur the kind of downtime disruption of making that happen. And this was based on my co-founder Jeff's master's thesis. We were doing this specifically for Linux and specifically for Linux kernel updates. And we said, well, look, this feels like an interesting technology. It's a problem we've had ourselves in administering systems. Like, let's try to build a company around it. And that's kind of all we knew. I mean, we didn't really know anything about running a business. We'd all studied computer science. And so what we did is, like, upon graduating, we rented this kind of crappy little row house in Central Square. I have some pictures of it. And we lived there, and then we also worked there. So this was like the living room, but the living room was also the office. So we set up our desks and monitors and stuff. And it was a 4-bedroom apartment. Is that right? Maybe a 5-bedroom apartment. And so my co-founders and I and like our early employees like all lived there on floors 2 and 3. And floor 2, I happened to like win the draw for having the largest bedroom. But what I didn't know is that by virtue of having the largest bedroom, I would also be hosting the conference room. So I'm going to show you some pictures from my room. So here was my bed and like got some books and stuff. And then if you turn a little there, I had like a little piano, but you're like, huh, why are there some chairs there? And you sort of continue looking, and I had like a little desk set up here and a couch, and like there's a Polycom speakerphone. Like we would hold meetings in here. So my bedroom was like the office conference room during the day, and then like where I slept at night. And then sometimes I think we had like a bunch of like MIT kids over at one point to like talk about what we were up to. And so that's like where we hosted them. The whole thing was very scrappy. Our server room was like also our laundry room. So you can kind of see that we've got like the laundry machine there and the server set up. And then that was actually an upgrade. The server room being the laundry room was an upgrade from what it was previously, which is where the servers were sort of on top of our fridge. And we stopped doing that because one time I closed the fridge like too aggressively, and then the servers fell, and we had to like get new hard drives. It was not a winning proposition. So as you can see, it was extremely scrappy. And then over IAP, which is this like MIT kind of like the month of January between the fall and spring semesters, we had a bunch of interns. And so they all like crowded into this little like room we had together. And like, here's the like pile of shoe. I guess because the floors were old and it was like wintry and slushy, where like everyone has to like not wear their shoes in this house, which maybe was not the best idea, but there's like an elaborate pile of shoes. And then the best marketing thing that we ever did at Caseflight is we had this idea of, look, rebooting is obsolete. And we went to trade shows and conferences and stuff, and we really want to send this message of rebooting is obsolete. So we bought people in this call even kind of recognize what these things are anymore. We bought these old floppy disks and we like very laboriously and manually labeled them. And basically the theme was like, look, rebooting is obsolete. You're not still using floppy disks. Like, why are you still rebooting for software updates? And we like had a little trade show booth and the whole thing was very fun. And we had like vintage hardware there as like part of the demo. And then kind of as Roman mentioned, we ran the company for about 3 years and then Oracle acquired it. And Oracle acquired it because they were really interested in sort of bringing the tech to their Linux offering. They said, oh, this is something differentiated you have. And if we incorporate it into our offering, it would be a reason to buy Oracle's version of Linux as opposed to Red Hat's version of Linux or someone else's version of Linux. And so here's Jeff actually signing the like acquisition paperwork. And so that was the first company. We were at Oracle for a year and a day, transitioning over the tech, and then kind of left immediately. We knew we wanted to start another company. And so we started our second company called Zoule. It was kind of getting the founders back together. The story with Zoule, and this was like, I guess like 2012 at the time. So this was like, what we set out to build is we said, listen, in the consumer space, like chat has gotten really good. Like people text and there's like Facebook Messenger and there's GChat and there's iMessage and all this stuff. But at work, like there still wasn't a robust kind of chat tool. And this was interesting and actually a somewhat contrarian opinion at the time, where I think the opinion of most venture investors was, look, chat is not a thing in business. It's not going to work. There are like lots of dead bodies on the shore of chat. And this was before Slack. Like your best option at the time was like, I don't know, making an IRC server or something. So we said, we're going to build like a robust web app, desktop app, mobile app chat experience. And the interesting thing about kind of getting the company started the second time was we had sort of built a reputation and a network of advisors from the previous company, which we had totally bootstrapped with the exception of the NSF grant and like a business plan, winning the MIT 100K business plan competition. And so the nice thing about that was that out of the gate, we were able to raise some money to kind of get started. And this is a quote from kind of one of our early investors. We were so enamored by the team, was even if your business plan was selling meth, I'd still invest in this team, which is, I think, a testament to kind of the caliber of the folks we'd assembled. But we hadn't lost our scrappy roots. So we rented an actual office this time, but still in Central Square. This one was above, I think, a furniture store that doesn't exist anymore. And then we didn't have any furniture, so we all kind of just like hung out in there. And then eventually we like got some more furniture. We hired some more people. We did a bunch of like team bonding activities together. Did a lot of whiteboarding, of course, about like the architecture of the system, et cetera, et cetera. We operated the company for about 18 months. And then actually Dropbox acquired it. And Dropbox acquired it, honestly, one part for the team, one part for the tech. And so we all moved to California. We were at Dropbox for about 2 years, kind of running product engineering, left. And then in early 2017, started Pilot. And the theme of Pilot really was born out of pain that we ourselves had extremely viscerally in our previous companies, which is to say, anytime anyone starts a company, it's because there's something they're trying to do in the world. There's a product they want to bring to market or a service they want to offer or whatever. And I think what we found was some of our time was being spent on that stuff, but a lot of our time was being spent on the back office, meaning the infrastructure, financial, like accounting, HR, legal, tax, IT, et cetera, like the stuff you have to do to cause your business to exist so that you can actually focus on running the business in the first place. And the specific area we wanted to focus on was the problem of accounting. And in the very first company at Caseflight, because we had bootstrapped the thing and we were extremely scrappy, I did our bookkeeping ourselves. I bought a copy of QuickBooks Desktop 2009 and like double entry bookkeeping for dummies, and we kind of figured it out. And then NSF, of course, has all these like somewhat complex like grant accounting requirements that we just like put our heads together on and figured out how to do. And I think the two insights that we had in our Caseflight actually were, insight number one was, it feels like if we're smart about building the right software tools, we could actually have a computer do the vast majority of this work. And actually, it turns out in Caseflight, in a way that was like not the right use of our team's time, we actually wrote a bunch of code to like help do our accounting. And it was funny because when Oracle acquired the company, you meet with the heads of integration of all of the different functions. You like meet with the head of legal integration and the head of product integration and the head of finance integration, head of blah, blah integration. So we met with the head of finance integration. They were like, describe to us like how your company is keeping its books. And we're like, well, it's on QuickBooks, and we've like written all this code, and the code talks to our billing system, and it talks to like the invoicing tool, and it talks to the payroll system, and it like makes all the entries for us. And so the books are always up to date. And I remember the guy said, he said, this is incredible. He's like, we're Oracle. We're the most sophisticated financial technology company in the world, and we don't have anything like this. Why? And this is what he said. I remember it very distinctly. He's like, why were you even doing Caseflight? Like, this is the idea that should have been your business. Like, this is the one that has the real opportunity. And we laughed about it. And then as you saw, we did a whole other company kind of between now and then. But when we came to start pilot, one is like that guy's words kind of stuck in our head. And it's not that we use any of that code, but the idea that like, oh, actually computers can do a lot of this work for us. And it's really valuable if they do. And then insight number 2 that we had was I've never talked to a business owner who has said, please sell me accounting software. If I talk to business owners, they say, well, look, what if you take care of it for me so that I can run my business? And so at Pilot, the idea was, listen, let's merge a team of smart, talented people who are actually the accountants that talk to you, the customer, and to take care of your stuff. And let's give them software superpowers. We're sort of building the Iron Man suit for our internal team. And the cool thing about that is like, we're actually solving the problem for you end to end. Because I think what the customer wants in this business is, I want to know that someone is taking care of this for me so I can focus on running my company. So that's a little bit about Pilot and kind of how we came to it. And in particular, the seed was really planted kind of as early back as the very first company. And I kind of told you I want to keep this upfront section brief because I think it's most interesting to kind of get into the weeds with folks' Q&A. Happy to talk about anything, whether it's fundraising or team structure or anything you like. I wanted to talk a little bit about key lessons that we learned in the course of our 3 startups, at Caseflight, at Zoule, and at Pilot. I think the first lesson, just far and away the first lesson, I think this is true no matter what, is I think it is team above all else. Meaning, if you have a great team, you have a good shot at making it work. If you don't have a great team or you don't have a team you get along with, your company will not succeed. It doesn't matter how good the tech is, how good the market opportunity is. It's the team that really, really sort of brings the thing into the world. I think the second kind of thing that was very top of mind for us, I think in looking at the history of this over our 3 companies, was thinking about market size. And I think this is a thing actually that we were not very sophisticated at in our very first company because I think we didn't have good intuition for it, which is, as you think about growing the business, you're setting out to solve a particular problem for a particular person. And the 3 questions I always ask are, how general purpose is it? Is it like a niche thing, or is it something that every company can use? And I'm talking about sort of a B2B company here, but the same principles apply. It's like, well, is this niche or is this general purpose? And then, is it a nice to have or a need to have? And then, is it cheap or is it expensive? And I want to talk about those second 2 in a second. But basically, the larger the market you target, the more flexibility you have, because you're never going to capture 100% of any given market. Even if you capture 1% of the market, you're going to feel really, really good about yourself. And so if you're pointing your business at a large opportunity where the market is big, you have some flexibility. You have a lot of room to grow, but you also have some flexibility in case like the initial version is not exactly right. And I think most folks, certainly we, when we were starting our first company, I think we're not particularly thoughtful about how big is the opportunity, how big is the problem that we're really solving. The related kind of third thing is what I sort of talk about as solving a hair on fire problem. And here's the thing that's interesting about this, which is, if I think about myself, on any given day, there are like 15 things I'm trying to do. And I'm going to spend time on the most important one. And realistically, in any given day, if I finish problems numbers 1 and 2, I'm feeling pretty good about myself. I never, ever, ever get to problem 15. And what does that imply about kind of as you're building a product or service you're bringing into market? For your buyer, you need to solve a really, truly hair on fire problem. This has to be an urgent, burning pain that they're willing to pay a ton of money to get solved right now. If they're like, yeah, this is it's a problem I have, but it's probably number 20, the business is not going to work. No one has time to solve problem number 20. And the thing that's tricky about that is it's a bit deceptive because it is a real problem. And so you would sort of naively think oh, this is a problem people have. There must be value to solving it. But I think unfortunately, people only ever get to kind of the hair on fire problem. And so I think about, is it a nice to have or a need to have? You want to be over at need to have. No one has time for nice to have, unfortunately, even though nice to have like does feel good. The fourth kind of lesson learned or takeaway is, I think, a note about workflow. And what do I mean by workflow? I mean, I think when you bring a product to market, you have to do one of two things. You either have to meet people where they are in terms of what your capability is, or if you're asking them to change their workflow, it needs to be very, very clear to them immediately why they should change their workflow and do it your way. And I'll give you an example of both cases. An example of the first case is like an electric car. The nice thing about an electric car is you get in it and you drive it, and it drives just like a normal car. You don't have to change your workflow. Like, yes, it is powered differently on the hood, it's different, but like the user experience of it, with the exception of needing to charge it, is broadly the experience of driving a normal car. So that's kind of option one. It's like, we're meeting you where you are. We have a new technology, we have a new approach, we're going to give you some better stuff, but we're kind of giving you the interface that you already know and are used to. I think option number two is, if you're going to change workflow, you can do that, but you have to sort of have the carrot for why the user should change their workflow visible immediately. And this is a little bit of a vintage example, but if you travel back in time to like 2010, like the iPhone came out and there were all these BlackBerry users, and the BlackBerry's like cool distinctive thing that it had is it had like a physical keyboard, and people were like in love with that keyboard because you could like type so well on it. And the people like switching from BlackBerry to iPhone, they're like, well, I'm going to lose the keyboard, but I love the keyboard. And like, what motivated them to switch? It's like, well, I'm going to lose the keyboard, but I'm going to get this like great web browser, and I'm going to get all these apps that I don't currently have. And so, yes, I'm going to have to relearn how to do my stuff, but the carrot for doing that relearning is like visible right away. It's going to hit me in the face. It's not delayed gratification. You can see the promised land kind of right away. And I think that's also, that's an easy one to mess up, where you're like, well, look, my technology is better. If you do it my way, it's going to be like way better. Yeah, it probably will be better if I do it your way, but if it takes me a month to see results, like, I don't have the patience to do that. I think people are just not gonna, people don't have the willingness to stick to it unless you really dangle something in front of them right away about why it's gonna be worthwhile. The fifth lesson, I think, is really one on price point, which is, if you can solve a problem that is cheap, or you can solve a problem that's expensive, it is better to solve a problem that is expensive. And this is a little bit related to kind of the hair on fire point, where if you think about kind of what the price point means, the price point is a proxy really for how much value you're creating for the customer. And so if you're really solving a big problem for them, they should be willing to pay you for it. And if you're not, well, then they won't be willing to pay you for it. So I think really, really kind of aggressively pressure testing on price point. It feels weird, but I think it's really, there's a lot you can do if your product is expensive that is harder for you to do if your product is cheap, from a hiring salespeople or doing certain marketing activities, et cetera, et cetera. You would be surprised at how much price point impacts that folks, I think, don't expect it to impact. And then the final lesson learned, and this is like very much out of the kind of Steve Blank playbook, and is true kind of for all the businesses that we've run, is like, you gotta talk to your customers. Like, talking to your customers is always time well spent, because they're the ones who are going to potentially buy. Your customers are your prospective customers. Like, they're the ones who are actually paying you for the service, or they're the ones who you think are willing to pay you for the service. And so it is critical that you understand kind of where they're coming from, what they care about, how they buy, what they're looking for in a solution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because if you don't, you'll like spend a bunch of time in the lab building a thing, and then you'll emerge several years later and you'll be like, here's my thing. And then like, no one will want it. And it's like, well, okay, then why do we spend all this time building this thing? Well, it's because we didn't talk to our customers to really understand like what it is that they would be willing to buy. And I think one of the things that's hard for engineers in particular is, if you have the concept and you're talking to prospective customers, I think the thing you should ask is not, do you think this solves a problem for people? You have to ask, like, does this solve one of your top 3 problems? Oh, it does? Well, would you pay me $10,000 a year for it? The question is not like, well, do you think someone would pay $10,000 a year? It's like, would you pay $10,000 a year? Like, okay, give me your credit card. Like, let me charge it right now. You really sort of have to make it not very theoretical for folks. It's like, is this solving a real problem that you have? How much would you be willing to pay for it? Because absent that, like, people's natural instincts are just to be nice to you. And they'll be like, yeah, it seems good. Like your startup will probably work. But you actually need the hard feedback of like, no, I would not pay for this because it's not that valuable to me. So in general, I'm a huge believer in like, don't spend too much time in the lab. Make sure you're spending enough time talking to your customers and your prospective customers and doing the work of discovering what are the features they care about, what is the price point they need to hit, what does it need to do, how big of a pain point is this for them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, that was a little bit of a whirlwind about kind of my own background, the companies we've done, and I think key lessons learned along the way. Again, I think this is most fun when it's super interactive. So I wanted to actually pause here. Looks like we got a handful of folks in the audience. Would love to see if there are particular topics folks would like to hear more about that we can dig in deeper on.
Great, thanks, Waseem. So as I mentioned before, if people can put in their questions in the Q&A box, then we can go ahead and start getting into the nitty gritty. So we have our first question. How did you protect your technology IP wise?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the first company, we had filed for a couple patents on the tech. And actually, I think the patents were quite important in like the ultimate acquisition of the company, or I think that was one of those strategic things that Oracle looked at and said, oh, they have some IP around this. And that's like, yes, we're getting the team and we're getting the code they've written, but we're also getting the patents. Now, the problem is that this is also sort of like a double-edged sword in the sense that actually initially Red Hat was going to buy Caseflight. And one of the things that Red Hat didn't like when they were evaluating Caseflight is they said, oh, Microsoft has this patent on stuff that we think is like kind of adjacent to your thing. And we're like, no, it's not adjacent. Look, we have this like expensive law firm that like wrote a nice memo about like why it's not adjacent. And they were like, yeah, we don't really care. It's like, it's too similar. Like, we're not going to do it. And so, the IP stuff, I think like, here's the thing. It's never going to cause your company to be successful, but I think it is a good like foundational investment or kind of layer of protection that you can take. Now, if you told me, look, I have a limited number of dollars and I could spend them on filing for the patent, or I could spend them on like getting my first customer. Depending on the business, my general instinct is like I would do the customer discovery, not the IP work. But ideally, you do both.
Great. So just because you've mentioned customer discovery a couple of times, and that was your final sort of key lessons. Can you talk a little bit about how frequently you were doing customer discovery? Because it's typically not just done once, but at what points while you were starting a company did you do that customer discovery?
All the time. I mean, here's an extreme example. In the third company, and to a lesser extent in the second company, we like got together and we said, okay, we know we want to do another company. What is the company going to be? Like we decided the team, and we knew we were doing a thing before we knew what the product was. And we had some hypotheses of like, oh, well, maybe we want to build something for like a enterprise HR buyer. Or maybe we want to build something for like a mid-market finance buyer or whatever. And so we would go and we would like have meetings with these folks from our network and be like, well, you run the HR team at a 1,000-person company. What are your top 3 problems? And like, what would you pay to have them solved? Like there was just a lot of like talking about in the abstract as we searched for an idea, like, what are your pain points? So there was a little bit of working backwards. And then when we started to have a hypothesis, we said, okay, like literally before writing a single line of code, let's go pressure test this with potential buyers. And those conversations never stop in the sense that like every sales call is also a customer discovery call in a very literal way. I'm not theoretically asking you if you to buy, I'm really asking you to buy the thing. And so I'm actually a big believer in one of the founders doing the early sales, because I think you learn so much that way. And I think it is hard to kind of like offload to a third party who doesn't know the details of the business as intimately as you do, or have the ability to change the course of business as intimately as you do.
Yeah, that's great advice. And again, having you get out there and talk to people so you can actually hear what they're saying.
Yes.
So another question, how developed was your prototype before you first showed it to potential customers?
Yeah, it's a good question. It depends on the company. So in the first company at Caseflight, like we had the initial prototype. It was my co-founder's master's thesis. So it just so happened actually that out of the gate, we had a thing that was fairly fully developed. at Zoule, the group chat tool, we like built out the basic version that we used internally for a while. And kind of as we were using internally, like we would do some usability tests with people, and it was sort of like increasingly iterated on it to a point where we're like, okay, great, let's try to get our first customers on board. But the answer generally is like, you should show things to people earlier rather than later, because if you're not on the right track, you would like to know that before you fully built out the thing. And then for the third company, and this is like a weird one, but it's an interesting point. You hire Pilot instead of hiring another kind of accounting firm or bookkeeper or whatever. And if you think about like what that bookkeeper is doing, they buy a copy of QuickBooks and they like click around, just decided in 2009 to do your books. And so when we started Pilot, before a single line of code had been written, I called up 3 founder friends of mine and I said, hey, I know you just started a company. What are you doing for bookkeeping? And they were like, I don't know, we haven't figured it out yet. And I was like, cool, congratulations, I'm your bookkeeper now. And I bought a copy of QuickBooks and like I did their books. And as I was doing their books, like Jessica, my co-founder, and Jeff, my other co-founder, would like look over my shoulder and be like, oh, we could probably build some software to do step 1, 2, 3. And so literally we sold the product on day 1 before a single line of code had been written. And now is a weird example because that is like sort of uniquely possible for this particular type of business based on how it works. But I think that spirit is really critical, which is, generally speaking, this is not always true, but we'll speak in generalizations here. I basically trust that you're smart enough to make the tech work. And so yes, tech is a risk factor, but I'm just gonna accept as a given that you're gonna be able to make the tech work. What that means is that the risk factor is not like, can you build it? I'm just gonna believe that you can build it. The risk factor is like, does anyone want it? Do you know who your customer is and what they want to pay for it and how they buy and what their budget is and what features they would need and blah, 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 blah. And like, you will not discover the answer to those questions in the lab. Like you won't any single time, when you're writing code, you're not learning about the answers to those questions. And that's not to say that the writing code is not important. Of course it is important. But if you haven't validated for yourself that people want the thing you're building, it may not be worth the trouble of building it to only then find out, hey, I've invested a zillion hours here and it turns out I didn't build the right thing because I didn't talk to people.
Cool. So we have a few audience questions. So at what point did you know you were on the right path and had product market fit? So you talked about doing customer discovery, and part of that is to figure out, can you solve a problem for the group of people you've identified? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the things you sort of are looking for are like a well-articulated persona. Like, who is the type of person who has this problem? And like the set of talking points and price points that resonate with them. So in other words, I think you have real product market fit when you are able to basically write down, this is the playbook by which I get customers. Like if I'm introduced to a potential customer, this is approximately what I'm going to say. These are the value proposition things I'm going to highlight. This is the price point I'm going to offer it. And then they'll buy it and then they'll actually like use it and stay with it. And like retention is good. I think if you have like that working for, I don't know, it depends on the business, but in a repeatable way, in a way that's not a one-off, it's just like, oh, it's just your 3 friends, then I think you've really got a product market fit.
Great. So you were talking about Red Hat was one of your potential customers, or you were talking to them. When did you begin to consider both Oracle and Red Hat as customers? At what point were you in the process with Ksplice?
Yeah, what's interesting, so the company was acquired basically 3 years after we'd started it. So pretty late into the process. I think at that point we had, I want to say like 1,000-ish customers, and we were doing 7 figures in revenue. And what's interesting is like they approached us because they were like starting to see us in market, and they said, oh, this capability is something we might want. Like, we want to talk to you about what that would look like. And I think that's a general rule, which is companies are really bought, they're not sold. In other words, I don't think you can really go knocking on people's doors and be like, oh, go buy my tech. Someone at the company has to be motivated to say, oh, this is a real problem that we have. Like, we'll invest in, we'll take a look here.
Great. And so you talk a lot about your team, and you've had, you're on your third startup with the same group of people, which is pretty amazing. You've been together with them for a long time. What's the secret to that? Where over the past 15 years, have you had sort of, people started to drift away, or has everybody been completely on the same page? And sort of how do you resolve any differences that you might have along that journey?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the reason it works is because it's a little bit of a non-answer. It's like we've been working together for so long that we really understand how we work together. And I think just like key and open lines of communication are really what enables that.
Yeah. And so did you sort of get, sitting in your conference room, did you guys ever get in sort of those arguments and say, no, we have to go this direction, and somebody else was saying, no, we have to go this? Or did you just kind of talk it through and you were all in agreement?
Look, I think two things have to happen. One is you need to be willing to talk it out until you've resolved issues. And the second is you need a clear decision-making process. Like if you really don't agree, ultimately someone has to make the call. And so you need both of those things. But I think the first move is not like jump to, oh, I'm just gonna make the executive decision. It's like, oh, we don't agree. Like, let's talk a little bit about why we don't agree to see if we can resolve it first.
Great. How early did you define your business model? Did that turn out to be the business model that you went with, or did you end up having to search more or sort of pivot?
For which company are you asking, sort of in general?
I think I'd start with Ksplice. I mean, that being your first company.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about Caseflight is we had the tech before we really had kind of use for the tech. Like we knew that we had a thing that was interesting and we're like, cool, we think this is valuable. How are we going to bring it to market? And initially we were like, well, maybe we'll license it to other companies. Like there were sort of a variety of kind of options that we experimented with. And one of the first things we did actually, we said, oh, this is cool. We're going to like talk to the Linux vendors and like get them to incorporate it, and they'll pay us a license fee, and like that's how it'll work. And I think that the theme that we heard consistently from these Linux vendors was like, look, this is interesting, but show me that someone wants it. Like, I'm not going to do the work up front to assume that this is valuable and like pay you money to get it integrated. You have to bring me the customers to show me that this is a thing that like people want. And so in that way, actually, the business model we landed on was a little bit out of necessity, which is the previous kind of proposed ideas just didn't work.
So, so when you think about Caseflight, so you're on your third company, and I can imagine that there was a lot that you were learning because you hadn't had a company by then.
Yes.
And now that you're in your third, what do you wish you knew when you were starting Caseflight that you know now after this being your third company?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is really the lessons learned that I outlined, which is the tech matters, but the tech is not the whole story. Like sometimes you have like a company in search of a bit, you have technology in search of a business model. And I think that's hard, actually. I wish, well, look, I'm happy with how everything played out, but in some ways, the places we really banged our heads against the wall in Caseflight were because we had tech, but we didn't know why we had it. We didn't know what we were trying to do with it. And the reason we had to iterate on, well, who's the potential customer? And we tried this thing and we tried this other thing is because we didn't have clarity about, we sort of ran the process backwards. We said, we have this like square peg and let's go try to find what hole it fits into, as opposed to let me start very problem oriented. Let me start very customer oriented. Let me hear about a problem you have. And then let me look in my tool bag and be like, oh yeah, I think we can make this work. Like, here's how I'm gonna do it. So in general, I'm a big believer in leading with the customer rather than the tech. And look, that's not right for every business. Sometimes you really, truly have a groundbreaking once in a lifetime tech and you like figure out how to bring it to market, but I think it's a harder path.
So somebody has a question about your Expo booth, right? So those were great pictures that showed sort of you guys there and a lot of buzz. How successful was that? Did that capture the buzz, or was that something that sort of opened the door in a lot of ways?
Yeah, it was very successful because our buyer attended those conferences. And what we found is our buyer was like the IT administrator who ran, like 10 to 1,000, server systems. And where did they go? Like they attended these conferences to figure out what to buy. So it worked only because that's where our buyer was. It wasn't like our booth happened to be genius. It was like the places we went were places that were frequented by the people who are our customers.
Gotcha. And so specifically thinking about Caseflight, but also in general, how do you determine your price point? You talked about really figuring out like how much somebody would pay for something that you're selling. How did you figure that out for each of the companies that you've built so far?
Yeah, I think you have to test it to see what the market will bear. And I think there are two kind of ways you can do it. One is a sort of a little bit fake, but like, what do I think the ROI is? Like when you buy my thing, how much time are you saving and how valuable is that time? And okay, so, X dollars, or when you use this thing, I'm saving you $100,000 or whatever, $1 million. And I can charge 10% of that and you have a very healthy 10x ROI. Like that's one approach. Another approach is to look at like comparable products in the space and see what they charge and say, oh, well, we want to be kind of comparable to what everyone else is. And there's an advantage to doing that actually, which is if your product is an existing market product and there are already players in the space, that's actually good, because what it means is that there are buyers who have a line item in their budget to buy your thing. So actually, like understanding what the line item is like, okay, well, on average, these companies have allocated about $50,000 to buy this thing. Let's make my thing try to cost about $50,000 so that there is like, they don't need to go get new budget approval for whatever. And the third is you just have to pressure test it in the market. You have to be like, this is what it costs. Do you want to buy it? And then if they say yes, maybe next time, this is in the very early days, next time you're like, well, actually it costs, next customer I ask for a price that's like 1.5x that. And like over time, I'm going to kind of get a feel for like, okay, there's no friction here. There's a ton of friction here. This is probably the sweet spot of like how it should be priced. But there's a whole, like pricing is like a whole art and science.
So, so I've seen a lot of startups who go through sort of this trough of despair, and that, they get to this certain point and they're like, just forget it. We don't want to go further with this. We're not getting customers. I don't think this business model works, whatever it might be. Did you guys run into that in any of your companies, especially with Caseflight as you were first starting out and sort of were new to the whole entrepreneurial focus?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the thing that helps moderate it is like having co-founders you trust, because hopefully what happens is like when you're feeling particularly down, your co-founder is like not feeling super down. And so they're able to like pull you up a little bit. So I think that helps. I mean, the thing about Caseflight that was, I think, very memorable for me is there were so many things that we worried about that just like did not matter, that felt at the time like company killing events. But I think you just got to keep your like eyes laser focused on like, do I have customers? Do they like what I'm doing? Do they refer their friends? How fast is my revenue growing? Like, I think if you have to be quite laser focused on like the metrics that really truly matter. And generally the thing that I think really matters, like at Pilot, I think about 4 things all the time. And it's not that these are the only 4 numbers I think about, but these are like the key numbers. I think about revenue and revenue growth. We have a revenue plan. Are we hitting the revenue plan? If not, why not? If so, great, we feel good. Then for our business specifically, we care a lot about gross margin, because our business is like people plus software together. And so it's an area of scrutiny for us in a way that for a pure software company, it probably wouldn't be. The third metric I look at is NPS, or Net Promoter Score, which is we survey our customers periodically and we ask, how likely are you to recommend Pilot to a friend? And we want to make sure that number stays high. And the fourth is cash burn. Like, when is the company going to run out of money? And how do I make sure that I'm managing our rate of spend to be appropriate given the company's metrics?
Okay. So let's see. Just looking through questions. And again, everybody put in any questions that you may have.
Yeah.
Let's see. What advice can you give to startups building AI-based deep tech startups? Is there anything in particular for them that you would give them beyond sort of what you've been talking about?
I mean, this is a strange opinion to come from an MIT trained engineer. And I'm going to say it provocatively, it's not 100% what I believe, but the technology doesn't matter, in the sense that I don't care if it is AI-based deep tech or if it's like a trivial algorithm that everyone already knows how to do. What I care about is, who's the customer? What pain are you solving for the customer? And does your solution actually address their needs? And I don't think anyone buys and says, you know what, I really need the AI powered version of blah, blah, blah. No, they say, look, I have a particular problem I'm trying to solve. And it may be that actually the AI version is the only version that's going to solve it. But it's like not how they're not really buying. I'm like, oh, cool, your thing is in Python. Great. Like, sell it to me. No, it's like, you're going to create value for me in some way. And so I think the danger of like these cool technologies is that you can get too in the weeds on getting excited about the tech and lose sight of like, oh, no, I'm trying to build a thing that someone's going to use.
So when you think about, so you keep saying the tech doesn't matter, which is great because it's about the problem that you're trying to solve, which is critical. Right. You know, we obviously see a ton of companies who are building stuff and there's nobody out there who's going to buy it. Right. Have you had just sort of companies approach you and to build technology for them, or sort of interested in you guys doing something for them versus you getting out there and trying to solve a problem? And if so, how did you handle that?
Not really. At least I can't think of a kind of obvious time that sort of occurred. And listen, just to clarify, the tech doesn't matter. Of course, the tech matters, but I think the problem is that the average engineer is like too focused on that. Now, you know, if we were talking to the audience of, I don't know, I'm just going to make a joke at someone's expense here, like the Harvard MBAs, I probably wouldn't be like, oh, the tech doesn't matter. I'd probably be like, you need to find some good engineers. But I think for our audience, like our natural bias is going to be, oh, I got to make sure the tech is awesome. And if I do, like, people will come. And actually, the thing has to work. So the tech does have to work in the sense that like your product has to be real. But again, my baseline assumption for this group is you're tackling these hard things, which may or may not be possible, but I have faith that you're going to figure it out. And I'm trying to give you the advice that you'll use once you back, like separately assuming that you're going to be able to make the deep tech work.
Yeah. So we have somebody who just went through the National I-Corps program. And for those of you who don't know, that's over 100 interviews, and you're sort of doing a lot of that customer discovery that Waseem is talking about. And what advice can you offer to a company pitching in the MIT 100K competition next month? Anything based on your experience?
Yeah, and this is going to be, again, a little bit of an annoying answer. Don't get too hung up on these business plan competitions, in the sense that building a strong business is distinct from winning business plan competitions. So yes, like work on your pitch and like do the things you need to do to tell a compelling story about like a big market and why you're the right team to solve the problem, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But like also don't get too hung up on that. In other words, if I had to pick between you win the MIT 100K or you get 5 customers, I'm going to pick you get 5 customers any day of the week. And so while, you know, it might be like a fun prestige thing to win the competition, it's actually much, much more valuable to do things that are in service of actually causing your business to succeed. And actually I remember very vividly, one of our advisors in the early days after we won the 100K, or as we were preparing for it, he was like, listen, cool that you're doing this, great. I think you have a good shot at winning, but remember that winning a business plan competition is not the same as building a successful business. And the same is true of fundraising, by the way. Like, raising money does not equal you've built a good company. It's a necessary evil to build a good company. It is not success.
That's a great distinction. How did you choose your advisors? So for each of the companies, and in what ways were they helpful? Because that's always a tough one with startups.
Yeah, it evolved kind of organically, actually, where I think the like best advisors in some ways are folks who either like have seen the movie before, like, you know, they themselves were operators, ideally in a company in a space that's kind of similar to your space, so they can give you good advice. Or in some cases, they're actually like, you know, the relationship might start out as like they were a particularly vocal customer or like a good evangelist for you. It's hard. I mean, I don't think there's any sort of like silver bullet kind of strategy for picking good advisors. I would say lean on your networks. I think for the folks here, like you actually probably do have good networks from your universities or otherwise. So, you know, look at who you're connected to on LinkedIn, or kind of look in your alumni directories or whatever to see if there are folks that could potentially be valuable, and then just try to get in touch with them and tell them about what you're up to. And then ideally, look, you have to be in the driver's seat on like using your advisors effectively. Like come to them with specific questions or specific things you need help with, because it makes it easier for them to help you, as opposed to just like, give me advice. It's like, that's like a quite open-ended prompt. Like, but if I'm like, hey, I have this particular question about, I'm trying to hire 3 new sales reps and I want to know how I should structure their comp plan. Like, okay, that's a question, that's a conversation we can have.
Yeah. So, so obviously you faced a lot of hurdles throughout your experience so far. What would you say the biggest hurdle? Because you talked about your sort of the lessons that you learned, et cetera.
Yeah.
But really looking back, what was the biggest hurdle that you faced in starting a company?
It's a good question. I mean, I think there's a bunch of, there's like, on a day-to-day, there's so many ups and downs. And I think just like managing your own sentiment around like, not letting the highs get too high or the lows to get too low. And then I think the other thing, and this is a statement of privilege, is like at the end of the day, I felt like, look, even if this thing doesn't work out, we have a talented team here. We can all get jobs somewhere else if we need to. In other words, I personally never felt like, oh, if this doesn't work, I like will be on the street or whatever. Right. And I think that, that's not true for everyone. And I think if you have that, that's like, recognize that you have a very powerful safety net there that is not available to the average person trying to start a business. And so in some ways that actually was very reassuring, which is like, what is the absolute worst case scenario? It's not that bad.
Right. So we have another question that, so you talk about solving people's problems, but you also mentioned that when Caseflight was bought by Oracle, it was also to give them an advantage over Red Hat. Can you just talk a little bit about sort of, how did that apply to you thinking about solving a problem?
Sure. I mean, so very tactically, the service that we built was solving a problem for these IT administrators, which is they didn't want to come in at Sunday at 3 in the morning to reboot their systems, to apply software updates. And we sort of gave them a capability where they could do that, like without needing to do that. Now, that same framework is true for acquisitions, which is like a company will buy your company if you are solving a problem for that company. They won't buy you because like they think your tech is cool. There has to be something that really, really motivates it. And for Oracle, I think the thing that motivated it was, look, we have this product in the market, but it's undifferentiated from anyone else's. It's like pretty commodity. You can buy it from Oracle, you buy it from someone else. So they were in search of like, what is going to let us tell a distinctive and unique story to the market about why our thing is better? And that's ultimately like what caused the acquisition. And what's interesting about that though, is it had very little to do with us. Like, I mean, obviously it had a lot to do with us. They bought our company, but it also like, it's not like I caused that to occur. It's just like one day that happened in the world and they called us. And so this is sort of what I mean is like, people do things because they like have problems that they're trying to get solved. And that's true both when you're selling to a customer, but also when you think about M&A.
Great. Roman, I think you had a couple questions as well. So I want to give Roman the floor for a few minutes.
Sure. So basically, pretty typical, I think, for Student Star. I'm getting feedback. Can you hear that?
I can hear you.
I think you have 2 audios going. I would just mute one of them maybe.
Hopefully that's better.
Much better.
Okay. So pretty typical for Ksplice. You had a student startup going based on things that you invented while you were a student. And you were searching for a problem and it took you a while to find that problem. And then I think what happened was, it seems like through your journey, you came across a problem in accounting. And now you're approaching solving that problem and building a business around it. So it seems, so you talked about how much easier that was, but what got you there was really that original experience still, right? So
certainly.
So I think many of the people in the audience here are kind of in that same boat. They have this thing that they built that they know, and they're searching for the problem still that they have to find. So
yeah, and I think my advice there is just like, make sure you're talking to lots of people who either have the problem or potentially have the problem. And like, hopefully, yeah, your tech is the key to solving it, but and this is maybe, again, a weird piece of advice. If you're talking to someone and they're like, oh my God, I would pay you $1 million a year if you could give me capability XYZ, and capability XYZ happens to be something that you can build, but like doesn't use the tech you already have, you should probably just put your existing tech on the shelf and like build the thing that they want. And I'm not saying be a consulting company, but I'm saying be a heat-seeking missile, like searching for customer pain and then solving that pain, because that is how you're going to build a product and a company and a business that's going to be very successful.
Well, great. Well, I want to thank you for joining us here. Katie, do you have any final words or?
No, I just want to say this was incredible. So, I mean, to have somebody who's started 3 successful companies so far, I think is an inspiration for everybody who was able to join us for the talk, and gives people sort of a little bit more insight into what that path forward in the journey looks like. So thank you so much.
Of course, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
And thanks everybody for joining us today.